Welcome to BookyRookie. Discover the classics like never before with BookyRookie. Dive into the world's greatest books through easy-to-understand summaries, top-quality translations, and immersive audio. Stream with BookyRookie, learn, and give back. www.bookyrookie.com. You're about to listen to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. Love it, have thoughts, or want to read the book? Check us out at www.bookyrookie.com. You're about to listen to Chapter 1, Down the Rabbit Hole. Alice was growing weary of sitting next to her sister on the riverbank with nothing to entertain her. She had glanced at her sister's book a couple of times, finding it lacked pictures or conversations, and wondered about the point of such a book. As the heat of the day made her drowsy and dull, she pondered if it was worth the effort to make a daisy chain. Just then, a white rabbit with pink eyes scurried past her. Alice didn't find it too strange to hear the rabbit mutter about being late, although she later thought she should have been more surprised. However, when the rabbit pulled a watch from its waistcoat pocket and rushed off, Alice was so struck by the oddity that she chased after it. She arrived just in time to see it dive into a big hole under a hedge. Without a second thought, Alice followed right behind. The tunnel-like rabbit hole suddenly dropped steeply, and Alice was tumbling down before she knew it. It seemed like a long fall, giving her time to look around and wonder what would happen. It was too dark to see the bottom, but the walls were lined with cupboards and shelves adorned with maps and pictures. Passing a jar labeled orange marmalade, she was disappointed to find it empty, but carefully placed it in a cupboard to avoid harm below. Alice mused that after such a tumble, falling downstairs would seem like nothing. She imagined how brave her family would think she was, deciding not to mention it even if she fell from the house's roof. As she continued to fall, she wondered when it would end and how far she had dropped. She guessed she might be nearing the Earth's center, about 4,000 miles down, recalling her school lessons. She then questioned what latitude or longitude she might be at, not knowing what they were but liking the sound of them. Soon she started pondering again, amusing herself with the thought of plummeting through the earth. It struck her as odd to imagine emerging among people who walked upside down. She guessed they might be called antipathies, though she felt relieved no one heard her misuse the term. She considered the need to inquire about the country's name, picturing herself politely asking if she had landed in New Zealand or Australia, all while trying to maintain the decorum of a curtsy midair. She chuckled at the notion of appearing ignorant for asking such a question and thought better of it, hoping to find the answer written somewhere. As she continued her descent, there wasn't much else she could do, so she resumed her musings. She thought about her cat, Dinah, and how much she would be missed that evening. She hoped someone would remember to give Dinah her milk at tea time. She wished Dinah could join her in the fall, musing over the absence of mice, but the potential of catching a bat, which was somewhat similar to a mouse. She pondered if cats ate bats or if it was the other way around. Since she couldn't answer either question, it hardly mattered how she considered it. Drifting into sleepiness, she began to dream about walking with Dinah, earnestly asking her if she had ever eaten a bat. But her dream was abruptly interrupted as she landed on a pile of sticks and dry leaves, and the long fall had come to an end. Alice was unharmed and quickly got to her feet. It was dark above, and another long passage stretched out before her. She saw the white rabbit hurrying down the passage and knew she couldn't waste a second. She dashed after it, just in time to hear its exclamation about how late it was getting as it turned a corner. When she rounded the corner herself, the rabbit had vanished. She was now in a long, low hall illuminated by a row of lamps overhead. The hall was lined with doors, but they were all locked. After trying each one without success, she walked down the middle of the hall, feeling disheartened and wondering how she would ever get out. Then, she stumbled upon a small three-legged table made of solid glass with a tiny golden key on it. She thought the key might open one of the doors, but it was either too small for the locks or the locks were too large. Nonetheless, she didn't give up hope, and on her second pass, she noticed a low curtain and behind it, a small door about 15 inches high. To her delight, the golden key fit the lock of this door. Alice turned the knob and was greeted by a narrow corridor, scarcely bigger than a hole fit for a rat. She bent down to peer through it, her eyes meeting the most enchanting garden imaginable. A deep yearning to escape the dim hallway and meander among the vivid blooms and refreshing fountains washed over her. Yet, the entrance was too small for even her head to pass through. She pondered how little use her head would be without her shoulders and wished she could compress herself as easily as a telescope. Given the strange events she'd recently encountered, she mused that the impossible seemed quite possible after all. Seeing no point in lingering by the petite door, Alice returned to the table, half in hope of discovering a new key or perhaps a manual on the art of collapsing oneself. Instead, she found a small bottle that wasn't there before, adorned with a tag exclaiming, "Drink me," in bold, inviting letters. Alice, prudent and cautious, was not about to sip from the bottle without a thorough inspection for any sign of danger. She recalled grim tales of children who suffered terrible fates from ignoring basic safety lessons, like the pain from holding a red-hot poker too long or the bleeding from a deep cut. She knew all too well that drinking from a bottle labeled poison was a recipe for trouble. Luckily, the bottle bore no such warning. She took a tentative taste and was delighted by the blend of flavors reminiscent of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and warm buttered toast. She couldn't resist finishing the entire bottle. Alice felt an odd sensation and realized she was shrinking. She was now a mere 10 inches tall, and her spirits lifted at the prospect of fitting through the door to the beautiful garden. However, she waited, slightly anxious she might continue to shrink and disappear entirely, like a snuffed-out candle. She tried to picture a candle's flame after being blown out, but couldn't quite grasp the image. After some time with no further change, she resolved to enter the garden. But to her dismay, she realized she had forgotten the tiny golden key. Even when she spotted it through the glass, it was out of reach. She attempted to climb the table's leg to no avail, as it was too slick. Exhausted and defeated, Alice sat down and let out tears of frustration. Alice scolded herself rather sharply, telling herself to stop crying immediately. She was good at giving advice, though she rarely took it and would sometimes be so harsh that she'd make herself cry. She even remembered once trying to punish herself for cheating in a solo game of croquet by pretending to be two opponents. But now, she thought, there was no point in such pretense. She was barely enough to make one respectable person. Her attention was drawn to a small glass box under the table. Inside, she discovered a tiny cake with the words, "Eat me," spelled out in currants. Alice decided to eat it, hoping it would change her size. If it made her larger, she could reach the key. If smaller, she could slip under the door. Either way, she'd find her way into the garden and was indifferent to the outcome. After taking a bite, she anxiously touched the top of her head to feel which direction she was growing. To her surprise, her size remained unchanged. Usually, eating cake wouldn't result in any changes, but Alice had grown to expect the extraordinary, and ordinary life now seemed dull. Determined to find a solution, she quickly finished the cake. You're about to listen to Chapter 2, The Pool of Tears. Alice was astonished and forgot her English for a moment as she exclaimed about growing taller like a giant telescope. She said goodbye to her feet, which were getting so distant that she worried about who would dress them now. She decided she would send her feet a new pair of boots every Christmas to be kind to them. She imagined how odd it would be to send gifts to her own feet and the funny directions she would write. As she grew, her head hit the hall's roof, and she was now over 9 feet tall. She took the golden key and rushed to the garden door, but lying down to peer into the garden, she realized she couldn't fit through. Feeling hopeless, she sat down and cried until she made a large pool of tears. Soon, she heard the White Rabbit returning, muttering about the Duchess and how upset she'd be for making her wait. Desperate, Alice was about to ask the rabbit for help when he was startled by her voice, dropped his gloves and fan, and ran off. Alice picked up the fan and gloves and fanned herself in the hot hall. She pondered how strange the day was compared to the usual yesterday. She questioned if she had changed overnight and tried to recall if she felt different that morning. She wondered who she could be if she wasn't herself, considering all the children she knew to see if she had been swapped with any of them. Alice was quite certain she wasn't Ada, noting that Ada's hair fell in long curls while hers did not. She also dismissed the possibility of being Mabel, as she was far more knowledgeable than Mabel, who knew very little. The confusion of identities overwhelmed her as she pondered, with Ada being Ada and herself being herself. Determined to resolve her identity crisis, Alice decided to test her knowledge. She attempted to recite her multiplication tables, but the numbers didn't add up correctly. 4 times 5 became 12, and 4 times 6 turned into 13, making it impossible to reach 20 at that rate. Deciding that multiplication wasn't important, she moved on to geography, only to mix up the capitals of major European cities, further convincing her that she must have been changed into Mabel. She tried to recite a familiar nursery rhyme, but the words transformed into a strange poem about a crocodile with a shining tail, grinning cheerfully and welcoming little fishes with a gentle smile. This was not how the rhyme was supposed to go, and Alice felt a surge of sadness, convinced she had become Mabel. She dreaded the thought of living in a small house with hardly any toys and countless lessons to learn. Resolute, she decided that if she was indeed Mabel, she would remain where she was. She imagined refusing to come up even if they called her, questioning her identity first. But her solitude weighed heavily on her, and she longed for someone to come down to her. While speaking, Alice noticed she had slipped on one of the rabbit's white gloves without realizing it, which led her to believe she was shrinking again. She stood up, measured herself against the table, and confirmed she was about 2 feet tall, getting smaller by the moment. The fan in her hand was the culprit, and she quickly dropped it to prevent vanishing completely. Relieved to have narrowly escaped disappearing, Alice was frightened by the sudden change, but glad to still exist. She then ran towards the garden, but to her dismay, the door was shut and the golden key was back on the table. Everything seemed worse than before, as she had never been so tiny. Frustrated, she declared the situation to be exceedingly unfair. While uttering these thoughts, she lost her footing and with a splash, found herself submerged in salt water, chin deep. At first, she believed she had tumbled into the ocean, thinking she could simply return by train. Alice recalled her single seaside visit and the typical sights along the English coastline: bathing machines in the water, children with wooden spades in the sand, rows of houses, and a railway station in the background. It didn't take long, though, for her to realize she was swimming in the massive pool of tears she had cried at 9 feet tall. Alice wished she hadn't shed so many tears as she swam around searching for an exit, half joking that she might be punished by drowning in them. On this peculiar day, such an event wouldn't even be the strangest occurrence. She then noticed a creature making a splash nearby. Initially suspecting a large animal like a walrus or hippopotamus, she soon recognized it as a mouse, also caught in the pool. Curious if the mouse could converse in this strange place, she decided to ask it for help in finding a way out. Alice had no prior experience talking to mice, but tried to recall the proper way, referencing her brother's Latin grammar. The mouse gave her a curious look and seemed to wink, but remained silent. Alice wondered if the mouse might not understand English and speculated it could be French, remembering the historical connection to William the Conqueror, though her grasp of historical timelines was fuzzy. She tried speaking French, asking about her cat, which startled the mouse into leaping from the water, visibly shaken. Alice quickly apologized, realizing her mention of cats might have upset the mouse. The mouse, in a high-pitched voice, expressed its disdain for cats. Alice tried to soothe the situation, suggesting that the mouse might appreciate her own cat, Dinah, for her gentle nature and skill at catching mice. However, she caught herself, as this only seemed to further agitate the mouse. She promptly dropped the subject, noting the mouse's bristling fur and trembling tail, and the mouse made it clear it had no desire to discuss such distasteful creatures as cats. Alice was in a rush to divert the conversation from its current topic, so she hastily inquired about the mouse's fondness for dogs. Receiving no response, she enthusiastically described a delightful little dog that lived near her home. She painted a vivid picture of the small, bright-eyed terrier with its long, curly brown fur, noting its clever tricks like fetching thrown items and begging for meals. She boasted about the dog's utility on a farm and its value, as stated by the farmer, of £100 for its rat-catching skills. However, Alice's excitement turned to dismay as she realized she might have upset the mouse again, which was now swimming away rapidly, causing quite a stir in the water. Concerned, Alice softly pleaded for the mouse to return, promising not to discuss any disliked topics such as cats or dogs. Hearing her plea, the mouse turned and swam back to her, looking rather pale, which Alice attributed to anger. The mouse suggested they move to the shore, where it would share its history, helping Alice understand its aversion to cats and dogs. It was certainly time to leave, as the pool was becoming crowded with various birds and animals that had also fallen in. Among them were a duck, a dodo, a lory, an eaglet, and several other intriguing creatures. Alice took the lead, and the whole group made their way to the shore. You're about to listen to Chapter 3, A Caucus Race and a Long Tail. A peculiar group gathered by the riverbank, birds with soaked feathers, animals with matted fur, all soaked and in a foul mood. The main concern was how to dry off. They held a meeting, and Alice found herself chatting with them as if they were old friends. She even debated with the lory, who stubbornly claimed to know better due to its age, but refused to reveal how old it was, ending the discussion. The mouse, who appeared to be in charge, instructed everyone to sit and pay attention, promising to dry them out quickly. They formed a large circle with the mouse at the center, and Alice watched it, worried about catching a cold from her wet clothes. The mouse cleared its throat and started to recite a historical account, but the lory couldn't hide its discomfort. When the mouse thought the lory had interrupted, the lory denied it and the mouse continued. However, the duck was confused by the mouse's story, asking what the archbishop found, but the mouse ignored the question and went on. Turning to Alice, the mouse asked how she was faring, to which she replied she was still as drenched as before. Hearing this, the dodo stood up, suggesting they find a more effective solution to their problem. The eaglet criticized the dodo for using complicated words and hinted that the dodo might not even understand them, causing some birds to laugh. The dodo, slightly offended, proposed a caucus race as the solution to getting dry. Alice questioned what that was, more out of politeness than curiosity. The dodo suggested the best way to understand it was to experience it and was about to demonstrate how it's done. Initially, it sketched a race track in a loose circle, declaring the precise shape inconsequential, and positioned the attendees sporadically along the path. There was no traditional start signal. Participants ran at their own whim, stopping just as arbitrarily, which made it challenging to determine the race's conclusion. After about 30 minutes of running, with everyone now dry, the dodo abruptly announced the end of the race, leading to a collective gathering around it, everyone out of breath and inquiring who had triumphed. Pondering deeply, the dodo took its time, reminiscent of Shakespeare's contemplative pose often seen in portraits, while the others waited in hushed anticipation. Eventually, the dodo declared that everyone was victorious and all deserved prizes. This prompted a flurry of questions about who would distribute the awards. Without hesitation, the dodo pointed to Alice as the obvious choice, and the group swarmed her, clamoring for their prizes. In a state of bewilderment, Alice reached into her pocket and, fortunately finding her box of comfits undamaged by salt water, she distributed them, ensuring there was one for each participant. The mouse reminded the group that Alice too should receive a prize. The dodo agreed solemnly and inquired what else Alice had. She reluctantly admitted to having only a thimble. The dodo instructed her to hand it over, and once more, the crowd encircled her. The dodo then formally presented the thimble to Alice, proclaiming it a token of their esteem. As the dodo concluded its brief proclamation, the crowd burst into cheers. Alice found the whole affair quite ridiculous, but maintained her composure due to their serious demeanor. With nothing to say, she simply accepted the thimble with a bow, trying to match their solemnity. The group then turned their attention to the comfits, which caused a bit of commotion. Larger birds struggled to savor the treats, while smaller ones choked and needed back pats. Eventually, the chaos subsided, and they reconvened, eagerly requesting the mouse to continue with the story. Alice gently reminded the mouse of its promise to share its history and the reason behind its aversion to the letters C and D, though she whispered the latter part, cautious not to upset it again. The mouse began its tale with a heavy sigh, and Alice, observing its lengthy tail, couldn't help but be puzzled by the mouse's description of its story as sad. As the mouse narrated, Alice's thoughts drifted, imagining a peculiar exchange between Fury and a mouse about a trial with no jury or judge, where Fury would act as both and sentence the mouse to death. The mouse, noticing Alice's distraction, reprimanded her for not paying attention. Alice quickly apologized, guessing that the mouse had reached a certain point in its tale, but the mouse, now quite irritated, corrected her sharply. Alice was always eager to lend a hand and, noticing a knot, she offered her assistance to untie it with a worried look. However, the mouse, feeling insulted by her nonsensical talk, refused her help and walked away. Alice, in distress, insisted she didn't mean to offend and noted the mouse's sensitivity. The mouse responded with a growl. As the mouse left, Alice pleaded for it to return and finish its tale, and the others chimed in, urging it to continue. Despite their pleas, the mouse quickened its pace, clearly impatient. The lorry expressed regret that the mouse wouldn't stay, and an old crab seized the moment to teach her daughter a lesson about temper control. The young crab retorted sharply, suggesting her mother was testing her patience. Alice, feeling alone, wished for her cat Dinah, confident that Dinah would bring the mouse back. Her curiosity piqued, the lorry inquired about Dinah. Alice, never missing a chance to talk about her pet, boasted about Dinah's prowess in catching mice and birds, unaware of the anxiety this caused among the feathered attendees. The bird's reaction was immediate. A magpie wrapped itself up, citing the night air's effect on its throat, and a canary hurried its children to bed. One by one, they all found reasons to leave, and Alice was left by herself. She regretted mentioning Dinah, realizing no one there seemed to appreciate her cat as much as she did. Overcome with loneliness, she cried. After a while, she heard footsteps. Hopeful, she looked up, half expecting the mouse to return with a change of heart. You're about to listen to Chapter 4, The Rabbit Sends in a Little Bill. The white rabbit returned, moving slowly and looking around with concern, as if searching for something it had misplaced. Alice heard it talking to itself about the Duchess, worrying about being executed and wondering where it could have dropped something. Alice figured out it was searching for a fan and a pair of gloves. She kindly started to look for them, but they were not to be found. The great hall and the little door had disappeared after her swim in the pool. As Alice searched, the rabbit saw her and mistook her for someone named Marianne. It ordered her to fetch gloves and a fan quickly. Alice was so scared that she immediately ran in the direction the rabbit pointed to, without correcting the mistake. She thought to herself that the rabbit had confused her for its housemaid and would be surprised to learn her true identity. However, she decided to find the fan and gloves. She found a neat little house with a brass plate reading W, Rabbit. She entered without knocking and hurried upstairs, hoping not to encounter the real Marianne. Alice found it strange to be running errands for a rabbit and imagined her cat Dinah might start sending her on errands next. She pictured being called for a walk and having to make sure a mouse didn't escape, though she doubted Dinah would be allowed to give orders in a house. She found a tidy room with a table by the window. On the table were a fan and several pairs of gloves. She picked up a fan and a pair, ready to leave, when she noticed a bottle near the mirror. It had no label, but she drank from it, hoping it would make her grow. She was tired of being small. After drinking, she grew so quickly that her head hit the ceiling. She had to bend down to avoid injury. She put down the bottle, wishing she hadn't drunk so much, as she was now too large to get out the door. Regrettably, she realized it was too late for regrets. She continued to expand, soon having to kneel on the floor. Before long, even that space was insufficient, and she lay down, pressing one elbow against the door and curling her other arm around her head. Despite this, she kept growing, and as a final effort, she stretched one arm out the window and one foot up the chimney, resigning herself to the fact that there was nothing more she could do and wondering about her fate. Fortunately for Alice, the magical bottle's effects had peaked, and she stopped enlarging. Nonetheless, the discomfort was undeniable, and with no apparent way out of the room, her spirits sank. She reminisced about her home, where size was constant and orders didn't come from mice and rabbits. She regretted her tumble down the rabbit hole, yet the allure of this peculiar life intrigued her. She thought about how such tales never seemed real until now, and she mused that a book about her adventures would be fitting. But with a sad realization, she noted she had grown up in the most literal sense, with no more room to grow. Alice then pondered whether she would age at all or remain her current age forever. The thought of never becoming an old woman seemed comforting, but the prospect of endless lessons did not appeal to her. Chiding herself for such thoughts, she questioned how she could possibly learn anything in such a cramped space, with no room for her or any books. Caught up in her thoughts, she oscillated between various perspectives, as if engaging in a full-blown discussion by herself. However, a voice outside interrupted her musings. The voice called out sharply for Mary and to fetch some gloves immediately, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Recognizing the rabbit's voice, Alice felt a surge of fear that shook her entire frame, forgetting her immense size in comparison to the rabbit. When the rabbit reached the door and attempted to open it, it couldn't, as Alice's elbow was in the way. She overheard the rabbit planning to enter through the window instead. Alice, determined not to let that happen, waited and then made a sweeping grab at the air as she sensed the rabbit near the window. Although she caught nothing, the sound of a startled cry, a fall, and the shattering of glass led her to believe the rabbit might have taken a tumble into something like a cucumber frame. An irritated exchange followed outside. The rabbit called for someone named Pat, and a new voice responded, claiming to be digging for apples. The rabbit, clearly annoyed, insisted on help with the current predicament, which seemed to involve more breaking glass. The rabbit demanded to know what was blocking the window. The reply came that it was an arm. The rabbit, incredulous at the arm size, filling the entire window, ordered for it to be removed. Following the exchange, a hush fell over the area. Alice listened as faint murmurs occasionally reached her ears, with phrases expressing dislike and cowardice. In response, she extended her hand once more, attempting another grab at nothingness. This time, the air was filled with a couple of sharp cries and the sound of shattering glass. She imagined a multitude of cucumber frames being the cause and pondered their next move, wishing they had the means to extract her from the window, as she was eager to leave. Time passed with no further sound until a series of small cartwheels rumbled and many voices overlapped in discussion. Alice made out a conversation about ladders, the need for teamwork, and concerns over the roof's stability. Amidst the commotion, a loud crash silenced the group momentarily, followed by inquiries about who would descend the chimney. Alice mused to herself about Bill being chosen for the task, noting how everything seemed to be his responsibility. She felt sympathy for Bill, considering the narrowness of the fireplace, but she also thought she might manage a little resistance. She positioned her foot as far as it could go down the chimney and waited. When she heard scratching sounds from above, she assumed it was Bill and delivered a sharp kick, curious about the outcome. The result was an uproar of voices, commenting on Bill's sudden exit, followed by a mix of concern and confusion over his well-being. Eventually, a weak voice emerged, which Alice attributed to Bill, describing his unexpected launch. The group's solution was drastic. They proposed burning down the house. Alice protested loudly, threatening to unleash Dinah on them. The threat brought immediate quiet, leaving Alice to wonder about their next move. She considered the sensible option of removing the roof. Before long, activity resumed, and she overheard talk of needing a barrowful of something. Her question was soon answered as pebbles flew in through the window, some hitting her face. Determined to end the assault, she warned them off, which again brought silence. To her surprise, the pebbles transformed into little cakes on the floor, sparking an idea in Alice. She speculated that eating one might alter her size, and since she couldn't possibly grow larger, she assumed she would shrink. Upon consuming one of the cakes, she felt a thrill as her body began to shrink immediately. When she was sufficiently small to pass through the door, she hurriedly exited the house. Outside, a gathering of various small creatures and birds awaited her. Among them was the unfortunate little lizard named Bill, propped up by 2 guinea pigs who were administering something from a bottle. The group surged toward her as she appeared, but she dashed away with all her might, eventually finding safety in the dense woods. Alone in the woods, Alice contemplated her next steps. She needed to regain her proper size and then navigate her way into the enticing garden she had seen. It seemed like a sound strategy, but she had no clue where to start. While searching the trees anxiously, a sudden sharp bark from above startled her. A huge puppy peered down at her with big, round eyes, clumsily reaching out with a paw. Alice felt a mix of compassion and fear, attempting to whistle to the puppy, though she was scared it might be hungry and consider her a snack. In a moment of panic, she grabbed a stick and presented it to the puppy, which leaped joyfully and playfully attacked the stick. To avoid being trampled, Alice hid behind a large thistle. The puppy continued its playful assault, barking with excitement until it eventually sat down, panting and half-closed eyes, a good distance away. Seizing the chance to escape, Alice took off and didn't stop running until the puppy's barks were barely audible. Resting against a buttercup, she caught her breath and fanned herself with a leaf, reminiscing about the adorable puppy and wishing she could have taught it tricks if only she were the right size. She then remembered her task of growing back to her normal size. The challenge was figuring out what to eat or drink to achieve that. Surrounded by flowers and grass, nothing seemed suitable. Nearby, a large mushroom caught her attention, and she decided to investigate it thoroughly, curious about what might be on top. Elevating herself on the balls of her feet, she peeked over the mushroom's brim and instantly locked eyes with a sizable azure caterpillar. It was perched atop, arms crossed in repose, serenely indulging in a long hookah, oblivious to her presence or anything else around. You're about to listen to Chapter 5, Advice from a Caterpillar. Alice and the caterpillar faced each other in a quiet standoff until the caterpillar, removing the hookah from its mouth, wearily questioned her identity with a drowsy voice. The question wasn't the best way to start a chat. Alice, feeling timid, confessed that she was unsure of herself. She knew who she was when she woke up, but she felt she had undergone several changes since then. The caterpillar demanded an explanation with a stern tone. Alice admitted her inability to clarify, as she was quite confused about not being her usual self. The caterpillar disagreed with her confusion. Alice politely tried to make the caterpillar understand by explaining how changing sizes so frequently throughout the day was bewildering. She suggested that once the caterpillar experienced transformation into a chrysalis and then a butterfly, it might understand the odd sensation. The caterpillar dismissed the idea, prompting Alice to acknowledge that they might simply feel differently about the situation. The caterpillar's curt responses irritated Alice, and she sternly suggested that the caterpillar should reveal its own identity first. Faced with another tricky question and sensing the caterpillar's foul mood, Alice decided to walk away. The caterpillar called her back, claiming to have something important to say. Alice returned, hoping for something worthwhile. The caterpillar advised her to keep her temper. Alice, struggling to contain her frustration, waited for more. After a few moments of silence, the caterpillar resumed the conversation by acknowledging Alice's belief that she had changed. Alice explained her difficulties in remembering things and maintaining a consistent size. The caterpillar inquired about the things she couldn't recall. Alice shared her unsuccessful attempt to recite, "How doth the little busy bee," noting how the words came out all wrong. The caterpillar then instructed her to recite, "You are old, Father William." Alice obliged and began the verse about Father William, who despite his age, performed headstands and somersaults, and even ate a whole goose, much to the youth's amazement. In his younger days, his father embraced the practice of law, often debating each issue with his spouse. The vigorous exercise this gave his jaw seemed to stay with him for the remainder of his life. The son, noting his father's age, found it remarkable that his vision remained as sharp as ever. He was astounded by his father's cleverness, especially when he managed to balance an eel on the tip of his nose. After answering 3 questions, the father felt that was enough. He warned his son not to get too proud and to stop bothering him with nonsense, or he'd send him tumbling down the stairs with a swift kick. The caterpillar, however, was not pleased with how the words were spoken. Alice, feeling a bit timid, admitted that some of the words might have been changed. The caterpillar was firm in its opinion that everything was incorrect, leading to a brief silence. Breaking the silence, the caterpillar inquired about Alice's desired size. Alice, not too concerned about her exact size, just wished for less frequent changes. The caterpillar, not understanding her perspective, continued the conversation. Alice, who had never been contradicted so much before, was trying to keep her temper in check. The caterpillar wanted to know if she was now satisfied. Alice expressed a desire to be a bit taller, as being 3 inches tall was quite unsatisfactory. The caterpillar took offense, as it was precisely 3 inches tall itself. Alice tried to explain that she wasn't accustomed to being that size. The caterpillar suggested she'd eventually get used to it and resumed smoking its hookah. Alice waited patiently for the caterpillar to speak again. After a while, it removed the hookah, yawned, shook itself, and descended from the mushroom, leaving a cryptic hint about the mushroom's sides affecting her size. Alice pondered which side of the mushroom would make her taller and which would make her shorter. After some thought, she broke off pieces from both sides of the mushroom. Trying the right-hand piece first, she was shocked when it made her shrink so quickly that her chin hit her foot. In a panic, she quickly ate some of the left-hand piece, which made her neck grow to an alarming length, leaving her head free but her shoulders out of sight. She wished the creatures wouldn't get offended so easily, but the caterpillar reassured her that she'd get used to her new size over time. Alice pondered over the mysterious greenery, questioning its nature and the whereabouts of her shoulders. She fretted over her invisible hands, despite their movement causing a stir in the distant foliage. With no success in reaching her head, she instead bent her neck with serpentine flexibility, weaving it through the air. She was about to navigate through the treetops she mistook for odd plants when a pigeon's sudden attack halted her. It mistook her for a serpent, despite her protests. The pigeon lamented its struggles with serpents, oblivious to Alice's confusion. It spoke of its tireless vigilance over its eggs and the lack of rest it endured. Alice expressed sympathy, slowly grasping the pigeon's perspective. The pigeon, however, continued to accuse her of being a serpent, despite her insistence that she was a little girl. The pigeon's skepticism was evident, its experience telling it no little girl possessed a neck like hers. Alice, firm in her honesty, admitted to eating eggs but argued that didn't make her a serpent. The pigeon proposed a theory that anyone who eats eggs shares a kinship with serpents. The conversation left Alice speechless momentarily, giving the pigeon a chance to accuse her of egg hunting. She quickly corrected it, stating her dislike for raw eggs and clarifying she had no interest in the pigeon's eggs. The pigeon, grumpy and impatient, told her to leave. It nestled back into its nest with a huff. Alice tried to hide among the trees, ducking and dodging, but her neck wouldn't cooperate. It tangled in the branches, forcing her to pause often to free herself. Then she remembered the mushroom pieces in her hands. She began to eat from them carefully, alternating bites, growing taller, then shorter, until she was back to her normal height. Feeling her usual size felt odd after so long. But she quickly adapted and started to think aloud. She had managed half of her plan. The constant changes baffled her. She never knew what size she'd be next. But at least she was her proper size now. The next step was figuring out how to enter the beautiful garden. While pondering, she stumbled into a clearing with a tiny house, only 4 feet tall. I can't approach them at this size, she thought. I'd scare them witless. So she nibbled on the mushroom again, not daring to approach the house until she was just 9 inches tall. You're about to listen to Chapter 6, Pig and Pepper. She paused for a couple of minutes, gazing at the house and pondering her next move. Suddenly, a footman dressed in a uniform dashed from the woods. She assumed he was a footman because of his attire, otherwise his face resembled a fish. He knocked on the door with a loud rap of his knuckles. Another footman, also in uniform, opened the door. He had a round face and big eyes like a frog. Alice noticed they both had powdered hair that curled all over. Curiosity got the better of her, and she inched forward from the woods to eavesdrop. The fish footman handed a large letter to the frog footman. It was an invitation from the Queen for the Duchess to play croquet. They bowed deeply to each other, getting their curls tangled, which made Alice laugh so hard she had to hide again. When she looked again, the fish footman had left, and the frog footman was sitting by the door, staring blankly at the sky. Alice approached the door and knocked timidly. The footman told her knocking was pointless since he was on the same side as her and the noise inside was too loud. Inside, there was a cacophony of howls, sneezes, and crashes. Alice asked how she could enter. The footman, still looking at the sky, said knocking would make sense if they were on opposite sides of the door. Alice thought this rude, but wondered if he couldn't help it due to the position of his eyes. She asked again how to get in. The footman said he would sit there until the next day. Just then, a large plate flew out the door, narrowly missing him and shattering against a tree. He continued talking as if nothing had happened. Alice asked louder how to enter. The footman questioned if she was meant to get in at all. Alice found the creature's argumentative nature exasperating. The footman repeated his intention to sit there for days. Alice asked what she should do. He said she could do as she pleased and started to whistle. Frustrated by his nonsensical behavior, Alice opened the door and went inside. Alice entered through a door that opened into a vast, smoke-filled kitchen. At one end, the Duchess sat on a 3-legged stool, cradling a baby, while the cook stood over the fire, stirring a cauldron brimming with what appeared to be soup. Alice thought to herself that there must be too much pepper in the soup as she tried to stifle her sneezes. The air was thick with pepper, causing even the Duchess to sneeze now and then. The baby alternated between sneezing and wailing incessantly. In the midst of all this chaos, the cook and a large cat, perched on the hearth and grinning widely, were the only ones unaffected by the peppery atmosphere. Alice, feeling a bit shy but eager to engage in conversation, asked the Duchess about her cat's peculiar grin. The Duchess abruptly called the baby a pig, startling Alice, but she soon realized the comment wasn't directed at her. The Duchess explained that all cats can grin, and most do, to which Alice responded that she wasn't aware of any that did. The Duchess dismissively remarked on Alice's lack of knowledge. Alice felt put off by the Duchess's tone and tried to change the subject. As she searched for a new topic, the cook removed the cauldron from the fire and began hurling kitchenware at the Duchess and the baby. Despite being hit, the Duchess seemed unfazed, and the baby was too busy howling to notice any additional discomfort. Alice pleaded for care as a large saucepan flew dangerously close to the baby's nose. The Duchess grumbled that if everyone minded their own business, the world would turn much faster. Alice, seizing the chance to display her knowledge, explained how the Earth's rotation affects the length of a day. When she mentioned axes, the Duchess made a violent suggestion, but the cook ignored it and continued stirring the soup. Alice tried to recall if the Earth takes 24 or 12 hours to complete a rotation, but was interrupted by the Duchess, who expressed her disdain for numbers. The Duchess then resumed rocking her baby roughly, singing a harsh lullaby that ended with a shake after each line, while the cook and baby added their own cries to the chorus. As the Duchess sang another verse, she tossed the baby so vigorously that its cries drowned out the words. Alice stood there, watching and contemplating her next move in the peculiar world she had stumbled into. The Duchess sternly lectured her child, administering a spanking whenever he sneezed, as he seemed to find pleasure in the tickle of pepper at his whim. As Alice entered the room, the Duchess, in a rush to meet the Queen for a game of croquet, hastily handed her the baby before darting off. The cook, in a fit of frustration, flung a frying pan in her direction, narrowly missing her. Alice struggled to catch the oddly shaped baby, which flailed its limbs in every direction, reminding her of a starfish. The little one snorted vigorously, and Alice found it quite a challenge to keep a hold of it as it wriggled and stretched. Once Alice figured out how to hold the baby by twisting it into a knot and securing its right ear and left foot, she took it outside for some fresh air. She worried that if she left the child behind, it might not survive, and felt compelled to take it with her. The baby made a grunting noise, and Alice, concerned, inspected its face. She noticed its upturned nose, resembling a snout, and its eyes were unusually small. Alice hoped it was merely crying, but saw no tears. Alice warned the baby not to transform into a pig, as she would have to disassociate herself from it. The baby made a noise that was either a sob or a grunt, and they continued in silence. Alice wondered what she would do with the creature when she got home. Suddenly, the baby grunted so loudly that she took a closer look and realized it had indeed become a pig. Feeling it was ridiculous to carry it any further, she set it down, relieved to see it trot away into the woods. She mused that while it would have been an unattractive child, it made a rather fine-looking pig. Alice then pondered about other children she knew who might be better off as pigs. She was contemplating the idea of transforming them when she was slightly startled by the Cheshire Cat sitting on a tree branch nearby. The cat grinned at Alice, who thought it seemed friendly despite its sharp claws and numerous teeth, deserving of her respect. Alice addressed the cat, asking which way she should go, pleased to see it grin even wider at her. The cat's response to Alice's indifference about her destination was that it didn't matter which path she took if she had no particular place in mind. However, Alice clarified that she wanted to end up somewhere, to which the cat assured her that she would, as long as she walked long enough. Alice, accepting the cat's reasoning, shifted the conversation to inquire about the inhabitants of the area. The cat explained that a hatter lived in one direction and a March hare in another, suggesting she could visit either since both were mad. Alice expressed her reluctance to meet mad people, but the cat informed her that madness was a common trait there, including in itself and Alice. Alice was skeptical about being mad just because she was there, but the cat proposed that her presence was evidence enough. The cat then went on to explain its own madness by comparing its reactions to that of a dog's, noting that it growled when happy and wagged its tail when angry, which was opposite to the dog's behavior. Alice tried to argue by calling the cat's growling purring, but the cat dismissed it and asked if she was playing croquet with the Queen. Alice expressed her interest, but noted she hadn't been invited. The cat told her they would meet there and disappeared. Alice, growing accustomed to strange events, wasn't surprised by the cat's vanishing act. However, the cat reappeared briefly to ask about the baby, which Alice said had turned into a pig. The cat seemed to have expected this and disappeared once more. After waiting for the cat's potential return and seeing none, Alice decided to head towards the March hare's residence, thinking it might be less mad than the hatter, considering it was May and not March. As she walked, the cat appeared again, questioning whether she had said pig or figure. Alice confirmed pig and expressed her wish that the cat stop its sudden appearances and disappearances. The cat obliged and disappeared slowly, leaving its grin behind, which puzzled Alice as she had never seen a grin without a cat before. Alice continued her journey and soon saw the March hare's house, recognizable by its ear-shaped chimneys and fur-thatched roof. She hesitated to approach until she had grown to a height of about 2 feet by eating more of the mushroom. Even then, she approached the house timidly, second-guessing her decision not to visit the hatter instead. You're about to listen to Chapter 7, A Mad Tea Party. Underneath a tree before the house, a table was arranged where the March hare and the hatter were enjoying their tea. In between them, a dormouse dozed off, being used as an armrest by the others who conversed over its head. Alice thought to herself that the dormouse must be quite uncomfortable, yet since it was asleep, it likely didn't care. The table was quite spacious, but the trio had huddled at one corner. As Alice approached, they protested there was no space, but Alice, feeling indignant, declared there was more than enough room and settled herself in a large armchair at the table's end. The March Hare suggested Alice have some wine in a friendly tone. Alice scanned the table, noting only tea, and pointed out the absence of wine. The March Hare admitted there was none, prompting Alice to criticize the offer as impolite. The March Hare retorted that Alice's uninvited seating was also impolite. Alice defended herself, noting the table seemed set for many more guests. The Hatter, who had been observing Alice with curiosity, abruptly commented on the need for her hair to be trimmed. Alice advised him that making personal comments was rude. Surprised by her response, the Hatter simply asked why a raven resembled a writing desk. Alice, anticipating amusement, was eager to solve the riddle. The March Hare questioned whether Alice believed she could find the answer. Alice confidently affirmed she did. The March Hare advised her to speak clearly, to which Alice quickly responded that she did indeed say what she meant. The Hatter disagreed, suggesting that saying what one means is not the same as meaning what one says. The March Hare and the drowsy dormouse chimed in with similar paradoxical statements. The Hatter then ended the exchange, and a brief silence fell over the group. Alice pondered the riddle, though she knew little about ravens and writing desks. The silence was broken by the Hatter, who inquired about the date. He inspected his watch, which seemed to be malfunctioning, and blamed it on the butter that had been used on it, despite the March Hare's insistence that it was the best butter. The Hatter grumbled about crumbs from the bread knife. Alice, peering over the March Hare's shoulder, remarked on the oddity of the watch that indicated the day but not the hour. The Hatter muttered to himself, questioning why his watch should be able to tell the year. It was a strange thought that Alice quickly dismissed, explaining that her own watch didn't display the year because it remained the same for a long time. The Hatter agreed, noting his watch was the same, which left Alice feeling quite confused. The Hatter's words were English, yet they made no sense to her. She expressed her confusion as politely as she could. In the midst of this, the Hatter noticed the dormouse had fallen asleep again. To wake it, he poured a little hot tea on its nose. The dormouse, still with its eyes closed, murmured that it was about to say the same thing, showing its annoyance. The Hatter, ignoring the dormouse's irritation, turned back to Alice with a riddle, asking if she had solved it yet. Alice admitted defeat, curious about the answer. The Hatter, along with the March Hare, confessed they had no idea what the answer was either. Alice let out a weary sigh, suggesting they could use their time better than posing unsolvable riddles. The Hatter then shared his unique perspective on time, treating it as a person one could be on good terms with. Alice didn't grasp what he meant, leading the Hatter to mock her, presuming she had never spoken to time. Alice cautiously mentioned her experience with keeping time in music, to which the Hatter attributed the reason why time wouldn't cooperate with him. He recounted a tale of a past quarrel with time during a concert for the Queen of Hearts. The Hatter had performed a peculiar version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, which the dormouse, even in its sleep, couldn't help but sing along to. The performance ended abruptly when the Queen accused the Hatter of murdering the time and ordered his execution. Alice was taken aback by the severity of the Queen's reaction. The Hatter explained the lasting consequence of the fallout with time, which was that it was perpetually 6 o'clock. This revelation prompted Alice to understand why there was an abundance of tea settings laid out. The Hatter confirmed her suspicion. It was always tea time, and they had no time to clean up. Alice wondered if they kept moving around the table as they used the dishes. The Hatter affirmed this was the case. Curious, Alice asked what would happen once they circled back to the start. The March Hare, tired of the conversation, suggested a change of topic and proposed that Alice should tell them a story instead. Alice expressed her uncertainty about knowing a story, which seemed to alarm her. The others decided that the dormouse would tell a story instead and woke it up by pinching it. The dormouse protested, claiming to have been awake the whole time and heard their conversation. The March Hare and Alice urged the dormouse to tell a story quickly before it fell asleep again. Rushing, the dormouse started a tale about three little sisters named Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, who lived at the bottom of a well. Alice, curious about their diet, learned they ate treacle. She thought it was impossible without getting sick, to which the dormouse agreed, saying they were indeed very ill. Alice tried to imagine what living like that would be like, but found it too puzzling. She questioned why they lived in a well, but the March Hare offered her more tea instead. Alice pointed out she hadn't had any tea to begin with, leading to a confusing exchange with the Hatter about the possibility of taking more or less tea. Alice ignored the Hatter's comment and asked the Dormouse again about the sisters' choice of home. The Dormouse claimed it was a treacle well. Alice started to object, but the Hatter and March Hare shushed her. The Dormouse warned her to be polite or finish the story herself. Alice apologized and encouraged the Dormouse to continue. The Dormouse then mentioned that the sisters were learning to draw. Alice forgot her promise not to interrupt and asked what they drew. The answer was treacle. The Hatter then announced a need for a clean cup and suggested they all move one place. In the process, the March Hare spilled milk into his plate, which worsened Alice's situation. Alice, cautious not to upset the Dormouse again, asked where the treacle they drew came from. The Hatter made a snide remark, comparing it to drawing water from a water well. The Dormouse confirmed they were indeed in the well. Alice was too confused to question the Dormouse further. The Dormouse continued, mentioning that the sisters drew all sorts of things that began with the letter M. When Alice asked why it had to be an M, the March Hare dismissively questioned why not. This left Alice at a loss for words. At this point, the Dormouse had shut its eyes and was drifting into a light sleep. However, when the Hatter pinched it, the creature let out a small cry and snapped awake. It continued to explain about things that start with the letter M, like mousetraps, the moon, memory, and muchness, and mentioned the saying about things being much of a muchness. Alice, feeling quite bewildered, began to say she didn't think she had seen a drawing of a muchness, but the Hatter quickly cut her off, telling her she shouldn't speak if she couldn't think. Alice couldn't stand such impoliteness. She rose in utter disgust and left. The Dormouse instantly fell back asleep, and neither the Hatter nor the March Hare seemed to care that she was leaving, even though she looked back a few times, half wishing they would call out to her. The last time she glanced back, they were trying to stuff the Dormouse into a teapot. Alice declared she would never return to that place as she navigated through the woods, calling it the silliest tea party she had ever attended. Just then, she noticed a tree with a door leading right into it. She found it odd, but considering the day's events, she thought it might be worth exploring. Without hesitation, she entered the door. She found herself back in the long hall near the small glass table. This time, she was determined to handle things better. She started by taking the little golden key and unlocked the door to the garden. After that, she nibbled on a piece of mushroom she had saved in her pocket until she was about a foot tall. She then made her way through a small passage and finally, she emerged into the beautiful garden, surrounded by vibrant flower beds and refreshing fountains. You're about to listen to Chapter 8, The Queen's Croquet Ground. Near the garden's entrance stood a sizable rose tree adorned with white roses. However, 3 gardeners were hard at work, painting the roses red. Alice found this odd and moved closer to observe. As she approached, she overheard the gardeners' exchange. One was upset about getting splashed with paint, blaming another for bumping his arm. Accusations flew about laying blame on others and past misdeeds involving the queen and a mix-up of tulip roots for onions. The gardeners, noticing Alice, bowed deeply. She asked them, timidly, about their task. They explained that they'd mistakenly planted a white rose tree instead of a red one and feared decapitation by the queen if she discovered their error. They were trying to rectify the mistake before her arrival. Suddenly, one gardener alerted the others to the queen's approach, and they all prostrated themselves. The queen's procession was quite the spectacle. First, 10 soldiers resembling the gardeners, then 10 sparkling courtiers, followed by 10 royal children decorated with hearts, all marching in pairs. Guests, including kings and queens, passed by, with Alice spotting the white rabbit among them. The Knave of Hearts, with the king's crown on a cushion, and finally the king and queen of hearts themselves, concluded the grand entourage. Alice debated whether to mimic the gardeners and lie down, but decided against it, questioning the point of a procession if no one could see it. She stood her ground and waited. When the procession reached her, it halted. The queen demanded to know Alice's identity, which Alice provided politely, though she reminded herself internally not to fear, as they were just a pack of cards. The queen, puzzled by the sight of the 3 gardeners sprawled around the rose tree, couldn't distinguish if they were gardeners, soldiers, courtiers, or even her own children since they lay face down, their backs marked just like the rest of the card pack. Alice, taken aback by her own boldness, dismissed the queen's inquiry, claiming it was none of her concern. Infuriated to a boiling point, the queen's face turned a deep red, and she fixed a wild, beast-like glare on Alice, demanding her execution. But Alice, with a strong and clear voice, dismissed the absurd command, and the queen fell silent. The king gently reminded the queen that Alice was but a child, which only served to anger her further. She turned away and ordered the knave to flip the gardeners over, which he did with a careful nudge of his foot. With a high-pitched command from the queen, the gardeners sprang to their feet and began a series of bows to everyone present, prompting the queen to demand they stop, claiming their actions made her dizzy. She then confronted them about their actions by the rose tree. 2, with a meek voice and on one knee, attempted to explain, but the queen, having inspected the roses, called for their heads. The procession continued, leaving 3 soldiers behind to carry out the sentence. The gardeners sought refuge with Alice, who assured them they wouldn't be beheaded and hid them in a large flower pot nearby. The soldiers, unable to find the gardeners, eventually gave up and left. The queen, eager to confirm the execution, was misled by the soldiers' response, believing the deed was done. She then inquired if they could play croquet. The question was clearly directed at Alice, who affirmed she could. The queen bellowed for the game to commence, and Alice, full of wonder about what would come next, joined the procession. A shy voice commented on the weather as Alice walked beside the white rabbit, who seemed quite anxious. Alice confirmed it was indeed a fine day and inquired about the Duchess. The rabbit, in a hushed and hurried manner, warned Alice about speaking too loudly, revealing that the Duchess faced execution for a minor offense. Before Alice could react, the queen's thunderous voice called everyone to their places, and chaos ensued as people scrambled. The croquet game that followed was unlike any Alice had seen before, with a croquet ground full of ridges and furrows, hedgehogs for balls, flamingos for mallets, and soldiers bending over to form the arches. Initially, Alice struggled to control her flamingo. She managed to secure its body under her arm with its legs dangling, but every time she straightened its neck to hit the hedgehog, the flamingo would twist to look at her with a puzzled look that made her laugh. As soon as she prepared for another attempt, the hedgehog would unroll and crawl away. The ground was uneven, and the soldiers, who doubled as arches, kept wandering off, making the game quite challenging. Everyone played at the same time, arguing and fighting over the hedgehogs. The queen quickly became very angry, stomping around and demanding beheadings almost every minute. Feeling uneasy, Alice realized she could be the next target of the queen's wrath. She knew how much they enjoyed beheadings and was surprised anyone was still alive. She looked for a way to escape and was puzzled by a strange appearance in the air, which turned out to be the Cheshire Cat's grin. The cat greeted her once its mouth was visible. Alice waited for its ears to appear before speaking. Soon, the cat's whole head was there, and she told it about the chaotic game, relieved to have someone to listen. The cat seemed to think its head was visible enough, and no more of it appeared. Alice complained about the unfair play and the noise of the quarreling players. She mentioned the moving arch and her failed attempt to hit the queen's hedgehog. The cat whispered a question about the queen. Alice, noticing the queen was listening, quickly praised the queen's chances of winning. The king approached, curious about the cat. Alice introduced the cat as her friend. The king didn't like the cat's appearance but offered his hand for it to kiss. The cat declined the offer. The king reprimanded Alice for her rudeness and for the way she was looking at him. He moved to stand behind her as he spoke. Alice recalled a phrase from a book about how even a cat is allowed to look at a king, though she couldn't remember where she had read it. The king, determined to resolve the issue, summoned the queen, who was nearby, and asked her to remove the cat. The queen, known for her simple and brutal method of solving problems, didn't even pause to look before she ordered the cat's head to be chopped off. Excitedly, the king went to fetch the executioner himself. Alice decided it was best to return to the croquet game, which was in full swing, albeit chaotically. The queen's angry shouts echoed in the distance, and Alice knew the queen had already sentenced 3 players to execution for missing their turns. With the game in such disarray, Alice couldn't tell when it was her turn to play. She went off to find her hedgehog. She found her hedgehog engaged in a scuffle with another. Alice saw this as a perfect chance to use one hedgehog to hit the other in the game. However, she realized her flamingo mallet had wandered off to the other side of the garden, where it was comically trying to fly up into a tree. By the time Alice retrieved her flamingo, the hedgehog fight had ended and both creatures had vanished. Alice wasn't too concerned, though, as the croquet arches had also disappeared. She secured the flamingo under her arm to prevent it from escaping and walked back to have more conversation with her friend. On her return, Alice found a large crowd around the Cheshire Cat. The king, queen, and executioner were in the middle of a heated debate, all speaking at once, while the onlookers were silent and appeared uneasy. As Alice arrived, they all turned to her to resolve their argument, bombarding her with their points. However, it was difficult to understand them as they were all talking over each other. The executioner argued that beheading required a body, something he had never done before and refused to start now. The king insisted that anything with a head could be beheaded and accused the executioner of talking nonsense. The queen threatened to execute everyone if the matter wasn't resolved immediately, which had caused the crowd's serious concern. Alice suggested that the duchess, the cat's owner, should be consulted. The queen, mentioning that the duchess was imprisoned, ordered the executioner to bring her. As the executioner left, the cat's head began to fade, and by the time the duchess was fetched, the cat's head had completely disappeared. This caused the king and executioner to frantically search for it, while the rest of the party resumed their game. You're about to listen to Chapter 9, The Mock Turtle Story. The duchess greeted Alice with warmth, expressing her joy at their reunion. She linked arms with Alice affectionately, and they set off together. Alice was relieved to see the duchess in such a good mood, unlike their previous encounter in the kitchen, which Alice attributed to the effects of pepper. She mused to herself that when she became a duchess, she would banish pepper from her kitchen, believing it made people irritable. She further pondered how different foods might influence people's temperaments, wishing that if only others knew, they wouldn't be so miserly with the sweet things. Lost in thought, Alice was surprised to hear the duchess speak again, noting that Alice's preoccupation was making her quiet. The duchess playfully suggested that everything had a moral, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. Alice, feeling a bit uncomfortable due to the duchess's unattractive appearance and sharp chin resting on her shoulder, tried to maintain politeness by continuing the conversation. They discussed the ongoing game, with the duchess offering a whimsical moral about love moving the world, to which Alice countered with a saying about minding one's own business. The duchess agreed, adding another moral about common sense. Alice observed the duchess's fondness for finding deeper meanings in things. The duchess then jokingly questioned why she hadn't put her arm around Alice, blaming it on the unpredictability of Alice's flamingo. Alice, wary of being bitten, didn't encourage the idea. The duchess compared the biting nature of flamingos to that of mustard, coining another moral. Alice pointed out mustard wasn't a bird, leading to a back and forth where the duchess humorously agreed with Alice's corrections, even pretending there was a mustard mine nearby, and crafted yet another moral about selfishness. Alice, not fully engaged in this last part, suddenly realized mustard was a vegetable. The Duchess concurred, twisting it into a lesson about being true to oneself in a convoluted way. Alice, trying to be polite, admitted she'd have an easier time understanding if it were written down, as the Duchess's explanation was hard to follow. The Duchess hinted at having much more to say, but chose to keep it to herself, clearly pleased. Alice, however, wasn't keen on hearing more and subtly discouraged the Duchess. In response, the Duchess generously offered her previous remarks as a gift. Alice thought to herself how unimpressive such gifts were, grateful that they weren't the norm for birthdays, though she kept her opinion to herself. Alice's contemplative silence caught the Duchess's attention, prompting a query about her thoughts. Alice asserted her right to think, feeling a bit on edge. The Duchess sarcastically compared Alice's right to think to the impossibility of pigs flying and was about to elaborate when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Alice was shocked to see the Duchess's voice fade away during her favorite topic, and she felt the Duchess's arm, linked with hers, begin to tremble. Looking up, Alice saw the Queen standing before them, her expression stormy. The Duchess greeted the Queen with a feeble attempt at pleasantries. The Queen, however, was not in the mood for niceties and issued a stern ultimatum, demanding the Duchess to choose between herself and her head, with very little time to decide. The Duchess quickly made her choice and disappeared. The Queen then turned her attention to the croquet game, urging Alice to follow her. Alice, too frightened to protest, complied. They returned to the croquet ground, where the other guests, who had been taking a break, scrambled to resume the game at the sight of the Queen, who warned them of the severe consequences of delay. The Queen was relentless during the game, constantly at odds with the other players and frequently ordering beheadings. The soldiers, who were supposed to be arches, were busy detaining those condemned by the Queen. Before long, there were no arches left, and all the players, except the King, the Queen, and Alice, were awaiting execution. Eventually, the Queen paused, out of breath, and asked Alice if she had met the mock turtle. Alice replied that she hadn't and didn't know what a mock turtle was. The Queen explained it was the creature used to make mock turtle soup. Alice, having neither seen nor heard of such a creature, was then invited by the Queen to meet it and learn its story. As they departed, Alice overheard the King granting a general pardon, which relieved her, considering the number of executions the Queen had ordered. They soon encountered a griffin basking in the sun. The Queen ordered the sleepy creature to take Alice to the mock turtle. Left alone with the griffin, Alice felt it might be safer with it than with the savage Queen. The griffin woke up, watched the Queen leave, and then chuckled to itself, finding the situation amusing. Alice inquired about the fun, to which the griffin explained that the Queen's threats were all for show and that no one was actually executed. With that, they set off together. Alice observed to herself that the phrase, "come on," seemed to be a common refrain in this place, as she trailed behind the creature. She couldn't recall ever being directed so much in her life. They hadn't traveled far when they spotted the mock turtle from a distance, looking quite forlorn on a small rocky outcrop. As they approached, Alice detected the sound of his heavy sighs, which tugged at her heartstrings. Curious about his sadness, Alice inquired about it to the griffin, who dismissively suggested that the turtle's grief was all in his imagination. They approached the mock turtle, whose large eyes brimmed with tears, though he remained silent. The griffin informed the turtle that Alice was eager to hear his story, prompting the mock turtle to agree to share his tale, asking them to sit quietly until he finished. They sat in silence for a while, with Alice wondering how the story could possibly begin if the turtle didn't start speaking. Eventually, the mock turtle began, revealing that he used to be a real turtle, which led to a lengthy pause in the conversation, punctuated only by the griffin's odd sounds and the turtle's continuous sobs. Alice nearly got up to thank him for his story, but she had a feeling there was more to come, so she remained seated and silent. The mock turtle, regaining a bit of composure, recounted attending school in the sea, where their teacher was an old turtle they called Tortoise. When Alice questioned the name, given he wasn't a tortoise, the mock turtle explained it was because he taught them, which he pointed out in a rather irritated tone. The griffin scolded Alice for her simple question, and they both gave her a stern look that made her wish she could disappear. The Griffin urged the Mock Turtle to continue, and he spoke of their sea school, which Alice hadn't doubted. The turtle insisted she had expressed disbelief, which the Griffin supported. The Mock Turtle shared details about their education, which included a curriculum of reeling, writhing, and various branches of arithmetic like ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. Alice admitted she was unfamiliar with uglification, prompting the Griffin to express shock and explain it as the opposite of beautification, implying that Alice was a simpleton for not understanding. Alice felt discouraged from asking further questions, so she shifted her attention to the Mock Turtle. She was curious about what else he had to learn. The Mock Turtle began listing his subjects, starting with mystery, both ancient and modern, combined with seaography. Then he mentioned drawing, which was taught by an old congaree who visited once a week to instruct them in drawing, stretching, and fainting in coils. Alice was intrigued and asked what that was like. The Mock Turtle regretfully admitted he couldn't demonstrate it to her, as he was too stiff, and the Griffin had never learned it either. The Griffin chimed in, mentioning he didn't have the time for that subject as he was busy with the classics master, an old crab who taught laughing and grief. Both the Mock Turtle and the Griffin seemed to feel a sense of nostalgia, and they momentarily covered their faces with their paws. Alice, wanting to steer away from the somber mood, quickly asked about the length of their school days. The Mock Turtle explained that their lessons lasted 10 hours on the first day, 9 on the second, and so on, decreasing each day. Alice found this method quite strange and remarked on it. The Griffin pointed out that this was why they were called lessons, because they lessened each day. This was a novel concept for Alice, and she pondered it briefly. Then she deduced that by the 11th day, they must have had a holiday. The Mock Turtle confirmed her guess. Curious about the schedule, Alice asked about the 12th day. The Griffin, deciding that they had discussed lessons enough, firmly suggested they move on to talk about games instead. You're about to listen to Chapter 10, The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle let out a deep sigh, wiping his eyes with the back of his flipper. He attempted to speak to Alice, but sobs kept interrupting his voice for a minute or two, as if he were gagging on a bone. The Griffin noticed and began to shake him and punch his back to help. Eventually, the Mock Turtle regained his composure, tears streaming down his face, and continued his story. He told Alice that she might not know the joys of living under the sea or have ever met a lobster. Alice started to mention she had once tasted lobster, but quickly corrected herself, saying she never had. The Mock Turtle described the lobster quadrille as a delightful dance, which intrigued Alice. She asked what kind of dance it was. The Griffin explained that it starts with everyone forming a line along the shore. The Mock Turtle excitedly added that there would be 2 lines, including seals, turtles, salmon, and others, and that they'd have to clear the jellyfish first, which the Griffin said usually takes some time. They would advance twice, each with a lobster as a partner, change lobsters, and retire in the same order. The Mock Turtle continued, saying they would throw the lobsters as far into the sea as possible. The Griffin interjected, telling them to swim after the lobsters, turn a somersault in the sea, and change lobsters again. The Griffin shouted these instructions with great enthusiasm. Finally, the Mock Turtle said that they would return to land, completing the first figure of the dance. After their energetic explanation, they sat down sadly and quietly, looking at Alice. She commented that the dance must be pretty, and the Mock Turtle offered to show her a bit of it. Alice was eager to see. The Mock Turtle suggested they try the first figure without lobsters and asked who would sing. The Griffin nominated the Mock Turtle since it had forgotten the words. They began to dance solemnly around Alice, occasionally stepping on her toes and marking the time with their paws. The Mock Turtle sang a slow, sad song about a whiting inviting a snail to join the dance, with lobsters and turtles eagerly advancing. However, the snail was hesitant, fearing the journey was too far, despite the whiting's encouragement that another shore awaited on the other side. The song ended with an invitation to join the dance, leaving the choice up to the snail. Alice expressed her gratitude for the opportunity to observe the intriguing dance, relieved it had concluded. She found the song about the whiting particularly fascinating. The Mock Turtle inquired if Alice was familiar with whitings, to which she nearly mentioned dinner but stopped herself. The Mock Turtle didn't recognize din, but insisted that if Alice had seen whitings often, she would know their appearance. Thoughtfully, Alice described whitings as having tails in their mouths, covered in crumbs. The Mock Turtle corrected her, explaining that crumbs would wash away in the sea, but confirmed that whitings do indeed have their tails in their mouths. The reason for this, according to the Griffin, was their attempt to join the lobsters in a dance, resulting in them being tossed out to sea. They fell a great distance and ended up with their tails stuck in their mouths, unable to free themselves. Alice found the explanation fascinating, admitting she'd never known so much about whitings. The Griffin offered to share more knowledge, asking if she knew why it was named a whiting. Alice hadn't pondered this, so the Griffin solemnly informed her that under the sea, boots and shoes are shined with a whiting, leading to its name. Alice was baffled by this notion and repeated it in wonder. The Griffin questioned her about the shininess of her own shoes, which she attributed to blacking. The Griffin then impatiently explained that under the sea, soles and eels are used to make shoes, something any shrimp would know. Alice's thoughts drifted back to the song, imagining if she were a whiting, she would have asked the porpoise to keep its distance. The Mock Turtle explained that having a porpoise present was a necessity, as no wise fish would travel without one. Alice was surprised, and the Mock Turtle emphasized the importance of having a purpose, or rather, a porpoise, for a journey. The Griffin, growing impatient, urged Alice to share her own adventures rather than dwell on explanations which could take an eternity. Alice hesitantly agreed to recount her experiences, starting from that morning, but pointed out the futility of revisiting yesterday, as she was a different person then. Thus, Alice embarked on narrating her adventures since encountering the white rabbit. Initially nervous with the creatures so close by, she gained confidence as she proceeded. Her audience remained silent until she reached the part about reciting, "You're old, Father William," to the caterpillar, which piqued the Mock Turtle's interest, who remarked on the peculiarity of the situation. The Griffin agreed, finding everything Alice described to be as curious as possible. The Mock Turtle reflected on how everything turned out differently than expected and expressed a desire to see Alice attempt to repeat something. He regarded the Griffin as if it held some sway over Alice's actions. Following the Griffin's prompt, Alice stood up to recite a verse about a sluggard, but her mind was preoccupied with the lobster quadrille. As she spoke, the words became jumbled and strange, speaking of a lobster complaining about being overcooked and needing to sugar his hair, trimming his belt and buttons with his nose and turning out his toes. As the tale continued, the Mock Turtle noted how the verse differed from his childhood memories, while the Mock Turtle dismissed it as nonsense. Alice remained silent, her face buried in her hands, wondering if normalcy would ever return. The Mock Turtle expressed a desire for an explanation, but the Griffin urged Alice to continue with the next verse, despite the Mock Turtle's confusion about the nonsensical imagery of a creature using its nose to adjust its toes. Alice felt compelled to comply, though she anticipated further confusion. She hesitantly continued with the next verse, which described an owl and a panther sharing a pie in a garden. The panther took the meaty parts of the pie, while the owl ended up with the dish and later, the spoon. The Mock Turtle interrupted, questioning the purpose of reciting such perplexing verses without explanations. The Griffin suggested it was time to stop, and Alice was relieved to do so. The Griffin then proposed another dance or a song from the Mock Turtle. Alice, eager for a song, requested one, and the Mock Turtle obliged, albeit with a voice tinged with emotion. He sang of beautiful soup, a rich and green delight awaiting in a hot tureen, questioning who would pass up such a delicacy for fish, game, or any other dish, and emphasizing the allure of the soup in a melodic refrain. The Griffin was eager for another rendition of the chorus, and the Mock Turtle was about to oblige when suddenly a shout about the trial starting echoed from afar. Without a moment's delay, the Griffin took Alice's hand, and they dashed off, leaving the song unfinished. As they ran, Alice questioned the nature of the trial, breathless from the pace. The Griffin urged her on, quickening their steps. Meanwhile, the sad tune of "Soup of the Evening" beautiful, beautiful soup, grew fainter, carried away by the wind trailing behind them. You're about to listen to Chapter 11, Who Stole the Tarts? Upon their arrival, the King and Queen of Hearts sat enthroned, surrounded by a bustling crowd of various little birds, creatures, and a complete set of playing cards. The knave stood in chains, flanked by soldiers to guard him, while the White Rabbit stood close to the king, holding a trumpet in one hand and a scroll in the other. At the center of the court lay a table with a large dish of tarts that made Alice's mouth water. She wished for the trial to end quickly so they could enjoy the treats. But it seemed unlikely, so to pass the time, Alice took in her surroundings. Alice, who had never been to a court of justice but read about them in books, was thrilled to recognize almost everything. She identified the judge, who was the king wearing an uncomfortable-looking wig beneath his crown. She also noted the jury box and the 12 jurors, a mix of animals and birds. She repeated the word jurors to herself proudly, feeling knowledgeable for her age. The jurors busily wrote on their slates, and upon Alice's inquiry, the Griffin explained they were noting their names to avoid forgetting them during the trial. Alice thought this was silly, but quickly quieted down when the White Rabbit called for silence, and the king scanned the room for the source of the noise. Alice observed the jurors writing silly things on their slates, and one even struggled to spell stupid, seeking help from a neighbor. She predicted their slates would be quite the mess by the trial's end. One juror's squeaking pencil was too much for Alice to bear. She stealthily took it, leaving the juror, Bill the Lizard, to futilely write with his finger, leaving no mark. The king commanded the herald to read the accusation, leading the White Rabbit to blow his trumpet thrice and read the charge from the scroll. It accused the Knave of Hearts of stealing the queen's tarts on a summer day. The king instructed the jury to consider their verdict, but the rabbit interjected, indicating there was more to come before that stage. The king ordered the trial to begin by bringing in the first witness. At this command, the White Rabbit, acting as the herald, sounded his trumpet 3 times and announced the first witness's arrival. The Hatter, who was the first to testify, entered the courtroom holding a teacup in one hand and a slice of bread and butter in the other. He apologized to the king for his impromptu snack, explaining that he had been summoned before he could finish his tea. The king, showing no sympathy for the Hatter's predicament, inquired about when he had started his tea. The Hatter glanced towards the March Hare and the Dormouse, who had accompanied him, suggesting it might have been the 14th of March. The March Hare corrected him, claiming it was the 15th, while the Dormouse chimed in with the 16th. Excitedly, the jury scribbled down all 3 dates, summed them up, and somehow converted the total into shillings and pence. The king then demanded the Hatter remove his hat, to which the Hatter protested that the hat was not his own. The king, misunderstanding the situation, accused him of theft, prompting the jury to note the false accusation. The Hatter quickly clarified that he was a hatter by trade and kept hats to sell, not to wear. Under the intense gaze of the queen, who had donned her spectacles to scrutinize him, the Hatter grew increasingly nervous. The king, showing no mercy, ordered him to present his evidence and warned him against showing any nerves, threatening execution on the spot if he did. This threat did little to calm the Hatter, who became so anxious that he accidentally nibbled on his teacup instead of his bread and butter. Meanwhile, Alice was experiencing her own troubles as she began to grow larger once more. She first considered leaving the courtroom to avoid the inconvenience, but then decided to stay, hoping there would still be enough space for her. The Dormouse, feeling squished by Alice's increasing size, complained about the lack of space, gasping for air. Alice, trying to be polite, explained her uncontrollable growth. The Dormouse retorted that his growth was at a reasonable rate, unlike Alice's sudden expansion. Offended, the Dormouse moved to the other side of the court. As the queen continued to stare down the Hatter, she demanded a list of the singers from the last concert. This request caused the Hatter such fear that he shook right out of his shoes. The king, growing impatient and angry, reiterated his demand for the Hatter's evidence, reinforcing the threat of execution. The Hatter, trembling with fear, began to describe his financial woes, mentioning his unfinished tea and the thinning bread and butter. When he mentioned the twinkling of the tea, the king interrupted, mocking the idea of twinkling beginning with a T. The Hatter tried to continue, but the March Hare hastily denied his next statement, leading the king to instruct the jury to disregard it. The Hatter attempted to proceed with his testimony, looking to the Dormouse for confirmation. However, the Dormouse offered no rebuttal as he had fallen asleep. The Hatter then mentioned that he had cut more bread and butter, leaving the testimony hanging in the air. A jury member inquired about the Dormouse's statement, but the Hatter couldn't recall it. The king insisted on remembering, threatening execution otherwise. This left the Hatter in such distress that he knelt, dropping his teacup and bread and butter, pleading his poverty. The king criticized his speaking skills, and when a guinea pig cheered, court officers swiftly silenced it by stuffing it into a canvas bag and sitting on it. Alice found this method of suppression enlightening, having never understood the newspaper reports of similar occurrences. The king dismissed the Hatter for his lack of useful testimony. The Hatter, already at floor level, was then permitted to sit. Another guinea pig's cheer was quickly stifled, leading Alice to hope for a more orderly trial. The Hatter, more concerned about his tea, was dismissed by the king. The queen coldly suggested beheading him outside, but the Hatter had already vanished. The king called for the next witness, the Duchess's cook, who entered with a pepper box. Sneezing from the crowd hinted at her identity before she even spoke. The king asked for her testimony, but the cook refused. The White Rabbit advised the king to cross-examine her. Reluctantly, the king asked about the contents of tarts, to which the cook replied, "Pepper, mostly." A drowsy voice contradicted her, saying, "Treacle." The queen furiously ordered the Dormouse's removal, causing chaos in the court. By the time order was restored, the cook had slipped away. The king, relieved, called for the next witness, passing the duty of cross-examination to the queen due to a headache. Alice, still growing, watched the White Rabbit check the list, wondering about the next witness's identity. To her astonishment, her own name was called out. You're about to listen to Chapter 12, Alice's Evidence. Alice, in her excitement and having forgotten her recent growth spurt, stood up so quickly that her skirt knocked over the jury box, sending the jurors tumbling onto the people below. They scattered like the goldfish she had accidentally spilled the week before. Mortified, Alice apologized profusely and scrambled to pick them up, driven by the memory of the spilled goldfish and the thought that the jurors needed to be returned to their box immediately or they might perish. The king declared the trial couldn't continue until the jurors were back in their places, emphasizing the point while looking sternly at Alice. She noticed she had placed the lizard upside down in her haste. The lizard was struggling, waving its tail sadly, but Alice managed to correct its position, though she doubted it mattered much for the trial. Once the jurors had gotten over the shock and had their slates and pencils returned, they started to write about the incident, except for the lizard who was too shaken and simply stared at the ceiling. The king asked Alice what she knew about the situation. She replied she knew nothing. When the king pressed, she confirmed she knew absolutely nothing. The king announced that her statement was very important, but the White Rabbit corrected him, saying he must mean it was unimportant. The king agreed, though he seemed unsure, repeating the words to himself. Some jurors noted the statement as important, others as unimportant. Alice saw this, but didn't think it mattered. The king then demanded silence and read from his notebook that anyone over a mile high must leave the court, which made everyone look at Alice. She protested that she wasn't a mile high, but the king and queen insisted she was nearly 2 miles high. Alice refused to leave, pointing out the rule was made up on the spot and should be the first rule if it were truly the oldest. The king, looking worried, quickly told the jury to consider their verdict. But the White Rabbit interrupted, mentioning new evidence, a letter found that was written by the prisoner. The king assumed it must be important unless it was written to nobody, which would be unusual. A juror inquired who the letter was addressed to, adding to the confusion. The White Rabbit explained that the paper had nothing on its outside and revealed it wasn't a letter, but a set of verses instead. This confused the jury. When asked if the verses were in the prisoner's handwriting, the White Rabbit confirmed they were not, which added to the mystery. The king suggested that the prisoner must have copied someone else's handwriting, which seemed to enlighten the jury. The Knave of Hearts insisted he didn't write the verses, and there was no signature to prove otherwise. The king argued that the lack of a signature implied the knave was up to no good, claiming an honest man would have signed his name. The king's remark earned applause for its perceived wisdom, and the queen quickly concluded the knave's guilt. However, Alice disagreed, pointing out that no one even knew what the verses meant. The king ordered the White Rabbit to read the verses, instructing him to start at the beginning and stop at the end. The White Rabbit, with glasses on, recited the verses, which spoke of characters giving and receiving messages and a secret kept between two individuals. The king found the recitation to be significant evidence, but Alice offered to reward anyone who could make sense of it, doubting there was any meaning to be found. The jury wrote down Alice's skepticism, but none tried to interpret the verses. The king suggested that if the verses held no meaning, it would save them the trouble of finding one. Yet, he couldn't help but think there was some significance, especially concerning swimming and the tarts mentioned in the verses. He tried to connect the lines to the case at hand, but Alice pointed out the inconsistencies. The king, pleased with himself, believed the verses to be clear evidence and even asked the queen about having fits, which she hadn't. Alice's sudden growth spurt and the resulting chaos with the jury box caused a pause in the trial, as described in the contextual continuation. In a fit of rage, the queen hurled an inkstand at the lizard. Bill the lizard had stopped using his slate because his finger left no mark, but then he quickly started writing again with the ink that was dripping down his face. The king made a joke about words not fitting, which no one found amusing until he pointed out it was a pun, prompting laughter from everyone. He repeated his instruction for the jury to consider their verdict, something he had done numerous times that day. The queen, impatient as ever, demanded a sentence before the verdict, to which Alice protested, calling the idea nonsense. The queen's face turned a shade of purple as she ordered Alice to be silent, but Alice defiantly refused. The queen's command to behead Alice echoed loudly, but no one moved to carry it out. Alice, now at her full size, dismissed the queen and her court as mere playing cards. Suddenly, the cards flew up and swarmed towards her. Alice let out a scream, a mix of fear and anger, and tried to fend them off. She then found herself on the riverbank, her head resting on her sister's lap, who was gently brushing away leaves from her face. Her sister woke her up, noting the length of her slumber. Alice recounted her bizarre dream in detail to her sister. After finishing her tale, her sister gave her a kiss, remarked on the strangeness of the dream, and reminded her that it was time for tea. Alice ran off, her mind still filled with the marvels of her dream. Left alone, her sister sat contemplating the sunset, thinking about Alice and her incredible adventures. She too began to dream, imagining Alice and the vivid world she had described. In her sister's dream, the creatures and characters from Alice's adventures came to life around her. The White Rabbit rushed past, the mouse splashed in a pool, and the sounds of the Mad Hatter's tea party filled the air. The queen's voice could be heard ordering executions, the duchess's pig baby sneezed, and the chaos of the Wonderland creatures surrounded her, all while the mock turtle's distant sobs echoed. Thus, she remained with her eyes shut, almost convincing herself she was in Wonderland, aware that opening her eyes would transform everything back to the mundane. The grass would merely be swaying in the breeze, and the pool would be disturbed only by the reed's motion. The sound of teacups would turn into the jingle of sheep bells, and the queen's loud calls would become a shepherd boy's voice. The baby's sneeze, the griffin's cry, and all the odd sounds would morph into the noisy clamor of a bustling farmyard, and the distant cattle's mooing would replace the mock turtle's deep sighs. She imagined how her little sister would one day grow up and maintain her childhood's pure and affectionate heart throughout her adult years. She envisioned her sister sharing incredible stories with other children, sparking their curiosity with tales of Wonderland from the past. She saw her sister empathizing with their small troubles and delighting in their simple pleasures, all the while recalling her own youthful days and the joyous summers of her past. Thanks for tuning into BookyRookie. Together, we're turning pages into possibilities. Let's make learning limitless. Catch you on the next stream.